Okay. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. We have a special guest tonight who will be addressing utility pricing, and in particular, a bill that she has introduced into the legislature this year to help alleviate some of the utility pricing problems that exist. And that is Representative Lindsay Sabadosa, whose territory includes Northampton. And I think most of us are on this call from Northampton, but also includes many other communities, which only she could possibly name all of. But we are thrilled to have her presenting tonight, and we are thrilled to have her as our representative because she is so responsive and so bright and so accessible. And we love working with Lindsay. And she has been our representative for the last, how many sessions? 4 years. Okay, so two sessions. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute and got ahead of myself with the slides. So just, why can't I find? There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me here tonight and for attending. I will go through the other communities I represent, so it's just in case anyone lives in one of those towns. So it's Northampton, Hatfield, Westhampton, and those were the towns that I've represented for the last 4 years. And with the redistricting, this, well, that technically happened in 2022, I added the communities of Williamsburg, Chesterfield, Goshen, Plainfield, Cummington, and Worthington, and lost the communities of Southampton and Montgomery. So I'm at 9 communities now, basically all of Western Hampshire County. So tonight we're going to get a little into the weeds with energy policy. But I think I'm getting so many emails, and I'm sure you are all receiving extremely high bills. And we really want people to understand why our energy prices look the way they do and how we got there. So my office has spent a lot of time digging into this. This is what we came up with as sort of the primer on where we are. And then we'll talk about one of the bills that I filed along with, I should say, Representative John Barrett from the Berkshires and Senator Paul Mark, and we'll talk about why we filed that. There's a little bit of a story behind it and some legislative legwork that went on. So basically, the overview of tonight is: how does electric pricing work in Massachusetts? Why is electricity so expensive? And what does the bill we filed, which currently has a House docket number? I recognize so many names on this call, so I know you're all a little bit of policy wonks, but you'll recall that HD is that first docket number that a bill gets before it gets an official bill number, which is going to be happening in the next few days now that committees are assigned. So let's start with, how does electricity pricing work? And we're going to go back in time to the 90s. Before 1997, electricity prices in Massachusetts were regulated, which is really interesting. I had someone reach out recently to ask why energy prices in Vermont are so much lower than Massachusetts, and the answer we came up with was Vermont still has regulation, but Massachusetts does not have that regulation. I'm just going to make the view. There we go. So now I can see all my slides. So Massachusetts got rid of its regulations in 1997, and it did that because the electric companies at the time had permission from the state to run a monopoly in exclusive service territories. So you would live in a few set towns, the electric company would provide services to those communities. You had absolutely no choice in what company you got, and you had no choice in what they charged. But in return for this, the state could regulate prices. So guaranteed businesses for companies, guaranteed prices from the state. There was a desire to change this, though, because our rates were really, really high. And I won't go into all of the details why, but there was also a fear that because of the way electricity generation was changing, our state wasn't going to be as competitive as other states because there were technologies that would allow generation in other states and transmission to Massachusetts. All of this seems maybe a little silly given where we are now, but this is what the frame of mind was in 1997 when the state passed the Electric Industry Restructuring Act. So that act allowed for sort of the situation we have now. You can choose a basic service plan from your utility, or you can switch to a competitive electric supplier. And some people have written to me in recent days and they've said, oh, look at, there are these competitive suppliers out there. I can get much lower rates, which is true. Of course, I'll remind you that those are only for the duration of the contract that you sign, and they can go up, but there are competitive electric suppliers. Those companies also are required to provide transitional rate reductions. And so, as of right now, about 500,000 people are subscribed to competitive suppliers, and the rest of us default to basic service. Now, that means that utility companies no longer know exactly how many customers they're going to have, which is, I think they would argue, a little bit of a problem. How does the pricing work? Competition in the electric generation market is said to encourage innovation, efficiency, improve service from all market participants, and will enable a reduction in the cost of regulatory oversight. This comes right from the Acts of 1997 and why there was this choice to deregulate. The idea was that the more competitive the markets were, it would give electric suppliers incentive to operate efficiently, open markets, provide electricity buyers and sellers with appropriate price signals, and improve public confidence. Again, I know this feels a little strange given where we are right now, but this was the mindset in 1997. So currently, and after 1997, the cost of electricity changes twice a year. And you're going to note there are differences for different companies. So we have National Grid, which changes its prices in November and April. Then you have Eversource, which changes its prices in January and June. And then you have Unitil, and I promise until we started doing this research, I had no idea what Unitil is, but they serve a very small number of customers, primarily in the Fitchburg area, and they change their prices in June and December. So if you're comparing your utility bills with your neighbors, you'll see that some of your prices started to go up earlier than others. But this does happen every 6 months as required. They sign contracts with suppliers to buy electricity over that period. And the utility gets to pay for it by charging customers this fixed rate for 6 months. So it's like we know what we're going to bring in from customers, and therefore we're sure that we can pay for the electricity. Utilities, however, aren't allowed to make a profit on the electricity. They're only allowed to make a profit on infrastructure and power delivery. And we're going to get to that whole question of pipelines and such a little bit later, but it's important to the conversation. So the Department of Public Utilities, possibly one of the most misnamed institutions in the states, gets to oversee this entire process. They make sure that the companies buy electricity to sell it to their customers with a basic service plan, they follow the law, and that they don't make a profit on that electricity. But they don't really have the ability to set or revise the price of electric supply unilaterally. So they can't tell the company that you must sell for a certain rate. Now, there's a lot of discussion within the legislature about whether this is true or not, but DPU firmly believes that they do not have that power. We're going to get to a transition, however, in the new commissioner of DPU, who, as you may or may not know, has decided that there is the ability to have a mid-season revision. So again, if you and your neighbor have two different providers and you're comparing plans, you'll note that National Grid customers are paying more for electricity than Eversource customers are. And that's from winter to winter. And we have the little chart that shows where all the providers are. And you'll see how National Grid is way above the others. And that goes back to when National Grid reports their rates for a 6-month period to DPU. Now, why did rates go up? It's, I think, important to underline the 3 reasons. So the first and we'll go here, is the turbulent world market for natural gas. So New England gets over 50% of its energy from natural gas. Interestingly, that has gone up, and I should not say natural gas, I should say from gas, but it gets its energy from gas, and that has gone up dramatically over the last 20 or so years. It used to be petroleum. We're still very, very, very fossil fuel dependent in our region. So, of course, we know about the war in Ukraine. Russia does provide most gas in the world. And so when the EU decided to cut their amount of gas purchase from Russia, it created a really fierce competition for gas that is going to last for a long time. We also in New England have I don't know if I'll say problem, but we are at the end of the pipelines for gas supply. We don't produce any gas here. It all has to be brought in, and our pipelines are consistently at or near capacity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then we have had this conversation, I think, about ocean tankers. Can you not bring in energy in other ways? But that really has to be done months in advance. And particularly for this winter, it was really, I don't know if it was impossible, but I don't think that the people who needed to make those decisions foresaw all of these events colliding to really have this enormous spike in prices. And then finally, there's this part where there's still uncertainty about the number of electric customers. I know, again, we've had a lot of people reach out and say, I'm going to switch to a competitive supplier. That causes uncertainty within the electricity industry about how many people they will continue to serve. And when you're not certain how many customers you're going to have, it's harder to predict what your profits are going to be as a company. And so those three things combined have sort of led to a perfect storm of rising prices. So the legislation that was filed, which is HD 3253, this legislation was filed after a letter that several legislators, but primarily John Barrett and Senator Mark from the Berkshires, led on. I think almost everyone in both the House and Senate signed on to it, asking for a mid-season rate review. The previous commissioner of DPU, Commissioner Nelson, said that that was not within DPU's authority. However, he was replaced when Governor Healy entered office, and the new commissioner felt that DPU did have the ability to do this. So, because DPU then revised rates, you should start to see, because prices of gas started to fall, you should start to see reductions in your rates in March. But I think it's important to note that you'll remember Eversource and National Grid are on two different timelines. So Eversource customers' rates are a little bit lower because that bridge was sort of winter and summer. For a National Grid, it's their 6-month period includes more winter months. So their summer rates are likely to be a lot lower than Eversource's because it's sort of balancing out. But the mid-season rate review will be beneficial to customers of every utility company. All right, so back to HD 3253. This bill would do very few things, but I think very impactful things. It would give the DPU the authority to prevent any rise in standard electric rates higher than CPI inflation. So we are sort of moving back towards that more regulated pre-1997 period. And if anybody is interested in the whole conversation about regulation versus deregulation, I can offer several papers that we read to put together this presentation that I think really explain why regulation is probably the better method. We could also look towards the state of Texas and what they've done with deregulation to show that regulating utilities is probably far wiser than not. It also says that the electric companies can't increase rates without giving 60-day notice to DPU and to the public and without holding public hearings. So we really want to know if a utility is going to come in and say, we need this higher rate, why that is, and we want the public to be involved in it. And then this last part is a little bit tricky. So we talk about how electric companies can't profit from the provision of electricity, but they can from the transportation and from pipelines. And so when they come in, they talk about what their operating costs are. What we would like them to do is to eliminate their advertising and charitable deductions from their cost of doing business when they're justifying rate increases. And we want them to do that because, as you might have noticed, the electric companies this year said, yes, we have to offer these really, really high rates, but we're going to offer these great charitable donations to the food bank, to other entities to help our customers. And I think at the end of the day, the customers would rather see money in their own pockets than to get a donation to the food bank, as great as all of our food banks are. They also do a significant amount of advertising that feels, I think, unnecessary for what is effectively a public utility. So what can you do if your utility prices are really high right now? Those municipal, there are competitive plans out there like municipal aggregation that could be right for you. Not all communities have municipal aggregation, but that is one of, I think, the best ways that we can help rein in utility cost. There are payment plans available. But I would say reach out to me if you are struggling. We spent a lot of last week helping people get on these payment plans and making sure that their utilities weren't shut off for the coming inclement weather. And I have found that it is much easier for us to talk to the utility companies than for regular people to talk to the utility companies. They're just a little bit easier to deal with. So we are here to help if you are struggling with your payments. And we put in this part about municipal aggregation because in all of our research, it just seems to be going back to one of the best things that communities can do. So for those of you who don't know, and again, I feel like I'm talking to people who do know this, but we'll go through it anyway. Cities and towns are allowed to purchase electricity in bulk for residents. Residents who are on a basic service plan when when their municipal aggregation plan starts are automatically enrolled, so you can opt out, but you're already opted in. And that is important in getting people to make that transition. And municipal aggregation just provides moderate price reductions and reduced fluctuations to residential customers. And like I said in the beginning, the three things that are driving increased energy rates are not likely to go away anytime soon. So no guarantees, of course, but it does seem like it is one of the better options. Um, Other things that are available for residents, there are discounted rates for people who are in need. We just passed the legislation that will allow people who qualify for SNAP, for Mass Health, or for free or reduced lunches, they automatically qualify for other programs. So if you are already on one of those, you can qualify automatically for discounted energy rates. And then of course there's the LIHEAP program, which is run in our area through Community Action Pioneer Valley. They are completely and utterly slammed this winter. They have hired new staff to help the old staff because there are so many people applying. If you are someone who is not in need of assistance, I will say if you're looking to make a charitable donation, Community Action may be a great source. And the reason I say that is because, again, this weekend we were helping a customer who needed a constituent who needed help with home energy heating, and that person had to pay 25% of the amount owed. They owed money to the utility company, and they had to pay 25% down in order for the utility to turn their heat back on. It was more money than that person had, and Community Action was able to do that, and they did it through unrestricted funds. So they take donations that people are able to give. So when you donate money to them, that is where your money is going. And it was a really special and wonderful thing to watch that happen and to have someone's heat turned back on in the middle of winter, which should not happen. But there is a loophole where the utilities don't have to turn off, they can't turn off your gas if you have gas heat, and they can't turn off your electric if you have an electric heat. But since electricity is required to run gas heat very often, they still can turn off your electricity, which does in fact leave you without heat. So things for us to work on as a legislature. And I think that is everything that I have for you, although I could probably talk about this for much longer, and I'm certainly happy to do so if there are questions. Is someone moderating questions or should I just?
Adele, you're muted. Were you going to take the questions?
Andra, if you're want to take the questions, go for it.
Okay. There are some questions in the chat, but I'll invite people to just raise their Zoom hand and we'll take you in order. So Laurie, go ahead.
Okay, I apologize. I don't seem to be able to turn on my video. It says the host has canceled my video, so I can't turn it on. But I will go ahead. I had some questions I put in the chat. First, I'd like to hear more about this idea that utilities aren't making any money on the cost of the power itself, as opposed to the delivery, it sounded like, because I don't think that can be right. The wholesale electric rate in New England, according to the New England ISO, is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour, but we're paying 20 or 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So at 50,000 people opting into other project, taking the electric choice, going to the website, Energy Switch Mass, and picking something, they're only 10%, less than 10% of our population is doing that, and yet they have about a factor of 4 profit margin here. So I don't believe that they're not making money on the price of power. That was my first question. Do you understand why they're not making money on the price of power?
So they're not allowed by law to make money on the price of power, but let's clarify that a little bit because there's always more than meets the eye, right? So they're allowed to make money on infrastructure and on transportation of gas through pipelines. So
which we pay separately for, right? We pay separately for delivery.
Exactly.
And that money hasn't changed. That's been about 13, 14 cents. I mean, it really hasn't gone up very much. It's the other one that's gone up.
It's the other one that's gone up for sure. So the rates that they submit to DPU, they're not allowed to make a profit on the electricity itself. However, because they are allowed to make a profit on the transportation, one of the things that they're doing is they're renting space on the pipelines to electric generation companies. And so that is causing rate increases because again, I'm trying to keep this simple because it's not. So for example, the gas that's going through is going to your home, but it's also going to a power generation company. On most days, there's plenty of room in the pipelines for both of those things to happen. However, there's not always, particularly when it's really, really cold. And when it's really cold and there's not enough capacity, then they start charging the electric companies more, which drives up that price. And so they are, in a way, profiting in both senses, but not when they go to the DPU and say, this is the rate that we're charging. From that, they're not allowed to have a profit.
All right, it sounds like this is pretty technical, but if you have a reference for how that works, I would love to have it.
I do. I have so many references that I'm happy to share with you, and I will answer other questions, but then I'll drop links in the chat. But I promise it is very complicated, and I think there are a lot of sort of tricky ways where they are legally not making a profit, and yet they are indeed making a profit. But it is important, I think, to understand that by law they are not allowed to make the profit, but they find other ways to do that. So this is where we went in with the legislation to say, and you can't do these other things. But I'll drop references in the chat.
Okay, and I want to let somebody else ask questions, but the only other thing I was going to ask about was municipal aggregation and why that takes so long. Right now, we're in, as you know, LEA is involved in this, and it takes years. It doesn't help.
I don't have the answer as to why it takes so long. I am hoping that there is going to be a change in that with new commissioners and new people at DOER.
So are we.
Yes, clarification.
Yes.
In the previous answer to Lori's question, it seemed like you were talking about gas pipelines rather than electricity rates. Could you clarify that?
I was talking about gas pipelines because a lot of gas is used to generate electricity in New England. It doesn't even have to be in Massachusetts, but we're renting we're not, well, I guess we are, because effectively we own all of these things, right? We're paying for them. So we are renting space within the pipelines for that generation, which is a profit maker for the utility companies, which I don't see there. I'm sure there are people on here. I don't see some of like the people that I know who are really fighting pipeline expansion, but those pipelines make a lot of money for the utilities, which is why they want to continue to expand them, even though on most days they aren't at capacity.
So, but then why would one utility like Eversource be charging less for electricity than National Grid, for example?
So they're only charging less right now because of when their rates are adjusted. So Eversource has the benefit of having a rate adjustment period that includes winter and summer months. And so their rates look lower because they're evened out. So for National Grid customers, the rates are going to look really, really high in the winter and much, much lower in the summer.
Mm.
Eversource is going to have a more even rate because of the way that's done. And I can't tell you why it's one way for National Grid, one for Eversource. I imagine it probably is something as banal as when the DPU can get them in. But they get different months and different 6-month periods because of that. Again, the new commissioner did say that rate revision is a thing and that it is within DPU's authorization. There is a lot of argument between the legislature and DPU as to what their authority is. The legislature believes DPU can do much more than DPU believes it can do.
Yes. Okay, Laurie, if you're done, can you take your hand down? And I'll just remind people that we're looking for general questions, not questions about your situation. So,
But I
Steve,
will say, if you have questions about your own situation, feel free to follow up after. I'm happy to.
follow up with Lindsay or your rep. Yes,
Yes.
Steve, go ahead.
First, Lindsay, thank you for a very clear presentation. A couple of things. People have said that one of the reasons the electricity prices are so high is that Massachusetts hasn't done so well putting in solar panels and particularly offshore wind. And a question I had, it's even before this time with these crazy increases, I kept hearing that Massachusetts had some of the highest prices for electricity in the whole of the United States. And can you give some more perspective on that, please?
Sure. Well, I'll answer it in two ways. The reason that we went towards deregulation was because we had some of the highest energy prices in the country. And I think that the deregulation of our energy prices has not improved that. I think there was a belief that there was going to be a lot more competition, that has just really not panned out. There are, like I said, these three public energy companies, one of which I honestly had not heard of until tonight. So effectively, we have two that serve the state, and there really isn't a level of competition. I don't think you have much choice, and so they are working, I think, to make money in other ways, but none of those ways have served the ratepayer. And I think they would argue that it is a combination of factors, but primarily our location on the pipeline and the fact that we are importing might not be the right word, but we are bringing into the region all of the gas that we use, and we still use an awful lot of it. And if you look, and I didn't put it in the presentation, but if you look at charts, we had up until about the 1990s, it was mostly petroleum. It was, I think, over 52% of our energy came from petroleum. That switched, and now it's gone to gas, which I think, people would argue, well, it can be produced in the United States. We're the second largest producer of gas in the world after Russia, but it's still all being brought into the region. We're not doing very much to generate our own power, and that is part of the problem. Sort of like if you're choosing between avocados and carrots, right? You can grow carrots in Massachusetts and they tend to cost less. Avocados get shipped from across the country and they cost a whole lot more. I did not talk about transition to green energy in this presentation because I wanted to really focus on why our energy prices are what they are, but I think you also hit upon what we need to do and the transition that we need to make, because honestly, utilities are going to argue if we just built more pipelines, this would solve all of the problems. I think it's very clear it would not solve all of the problems. And so transitioning and generating our own power is the only way forward for our region, but that's for another conversation.
Felicia.
This is just a quick comment. It's not really a question, but I know that community choice aggregation can help bring down prices. But what we're hoping in our case is to maybe keep prices stable and use some of the money to develop more green capacity. So you know, that's hopefully DPO will think that's a good idea.
Lindsay, will you share your slides? I
100%.
can't read fast enough, but I'd like to be able to. Thank you.
Of course. And like I said, I will put other links in the chat. We have some good resources on regulation versus deregulation and the problems that that's caused, as well as more detailed information about pipeline usage and how that's generated increased costs. I think Kim.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm here from, as a member of Northampton Neighbors, and I think I see a few familiar names from that Northampton Neighbors list. The price hikes are really affecting elders
Yes.
in some very tough ways. And I just want to say that Northampton Neighbors does have a small ad hoc energy group that's concerned about the impact of these prices and groceries and everything else on elders. It's very, very difficult. One question I had was, the utilities have that list for folks that can get discounts, and some of the cities, well, each city or town in Massachusetts has the ability to offer a property tax abatement work-off program for seniors. I don't see that on the eligible list that the utilities offer. And I know that the tax write-off program for each town and city requires look at the taxes and an application and a qualification to come within a certain income level. So that seems like the tax write-off, property tax write-off folks who are eligible should be able to get on those lists for discounts. And we all get a letter from the city every year saying whether or not we're eligible.
That's really helpful and something that we should be talking about. So I will try to figure out who the right people are to have that conversation. There are a couple, I've actually been in very close contact with the folks at Community Action to try to talk about why ways that we can improve the program, particularly for elders. I want to also say, because you might, especially if you're working with Northampton Neighbors, you might have individuals who are potentially in danger of having an electric shutoff. We do have a moratorium in Massachusetts. We're trying to get that extended through April, particularly with climate change. As we saw, it could be 60 degrees one day and then 19 the next. So it's important that we extend the moratorium as long as possible. But getting on the do not shut off list, which is, you're right, if you're over the age of 65, they cannot shut you off. You actually have to call DPU to get on that list. And people don't know that. And we ran into this the other day where, we had somebody, again, who was shut off, and they said, well, she has to call DPU and say that she was over 75, over the age of 75, to not be shut off. And I mean, to ask somebody who's already in a stressful situation, who's struggling, to call DPU. I call DPU all the time. They don't pick up the phone half the time. So it's just something that you should know and know in advance so that you can get on that list if you think this could ever be a problem for you. I see just a comment in the chat. Well, Therese, you have your hand up. I'll go to you and then I'll address some of the comments in the chat.
Thank you. I wanted to know what we can do to support the bill and support you supporting the bill.
Thank you. I mean, reaching out to other legislators right now is really important. We're going to start. We kind of delayed in asking for co-sponsorships of things just because watching the House this year. We hadn't formed committees. We didn't really know who was where. So we're going to start pushing for more co-sponsors now that there's a little bit of, I don't know if there's calm, but at least people don't look quite so terrified. Particularly the new people have looked rather terrified when they open their emails. So it's a little bit easier to have the conversation now. So any help in that, and I'll certainly be in touch when it comes up for a hearing. And I think, one of the things to make sure legislators know, and I'm sure most of us do, but it's really good to reiterate, the energy price problem is not going away. It's not like this winter is going to end and all of a sudden prices are going to go back to normal. It certainly doesn't look like the situation in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon. That is going to keep causing fluctuations. And the transition to green energy is happening far slower than I think all of us would like to see. And even when we get much more of our energy from renewable sources, there are still going to be people who are left behind in that transition. And so this is something that is going to be ongoing. So that's something legislators need to hear because, the seasons change, it gets warm out, and everybody is going to forget that we had a cold winter and that we need to do something. Although a lot of people have air conditioning and their energy prices will go up there too.
Thank you.
Other questions before we thank Lindsay and let her go?
I saw, if I may, someone in the chat, I'm just putting in the bill number again. Someone in the chat asked about how to donate to community action. I'll drop that link in there. But someone asked about renters. And so I want to say Maura Healey is planning to release a tax package on March 1st. We tried to pass an increase in the renters tax deduction last session. I think you're going to see that come back. I don't know how much it's going to be in what she's proposing, but I would expect that to come through. There's also going to be the senior circuit breaker tax. That one's really important because it's a refundable tax. So that means even if you don't owe money, you can still get that back. And it just kind of helps make ends meet. And I know particularly for the Northampton Neighbors folks who are trying to help people who are struggling to make ends meet, that's going to be a really important piece. And it all kind of got blown up with the economic development bill last session, but we're coming back for those pieces.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. We're so glad to have your explanations, to have your representation of many of our communities that local energy advocates draws from, and it was very helpful.
Of course.
Thank you.
You, everybody. I'm going to stay on for a second. I know you have a full agenda, but I'll put some more links in the chat. And if
Great.
anybody has any individual questions, please reach out. I'm more than happy to help. I will also put my email address in the chat.